Khorne loves a good scrap. Tzeentch doesn't even know his own plans. Nurgle is green. Slaanesh follows their nature. The Great Horned Rat has endless followers. And then there's a name every lore video skips. Not because the lore is thin, not because it's boring in the way obscure things are boring, because Games Workshop found themselves in a legal dispute with the character's creators in 1987, chose the cheapest available exit, and spent the next 30-plus years hoping the community would move on. The community didn't move on. 3 separate commenters flagged the missing god in a single video's comment section without coordinating. One wrote, "Pour one out for Malal." One wrote, "Where's Malal?" A third noted that it was a shame the renamed version wasn't more fully developed in official canon. 3 people, same absence, 0 prompting, 3 different registers of grief. 1 eulogy, 1 shout, 1 quiet frustration about a workaround that never got taken seriously enough. His name is Malal. Domain: the self-destruction of chaos itself. Canon status in Warhammer Fantasy: explicitly gone. Current existence in Warhammer 40,000, technically alive under a different name at what the official fandom wiki describes as the barest margin of canonicity. If you want to understand why a mythology as detailed and internally documented as Warhammer's has a structural hole that fans can feel without fully articulating, Malal is where you start pulling the thread. One honest number before we go further. The Malal signal in the analytics is sharp but small. 9 total engagements across 3 comments, roughly 2.2% of overall comment interaction. The keyword Khorne appears in 91 comment engagements from the same source material, and a single passage about a Khorne priest speaking almost in poetics pulled 7 likes on its own. Real demand there, broad demand. But Khorne has coverage. Every lore channel covers Khorne. Malal is the gap nobody's filling, and the 3 people who flagged him did it with the specific energy of people who have been waiting a long time for someone to say it out loud. This video is for them. White Dwarf Issue 83, 1985. A Warhammer Fantasy battle mini-scenario called The Crude, the Mad, and the Rusty. This is where the documented record starts, the first confirmed GW appearance of Malal and the character who served him, a Chaos warrior named Caleb Dark. The quest of Caleb Dark ran across multiple White Dwarf issues from 1985 to 1987. Rick Priestley, GW games designer and credited architect of the Warhammer Fantasy Battle Rules system, confirmed the origin in a 2024 interview on the Awesome Lies blog. His exact words: "The final section includes the gods introduced via the Caleb Dark comic strip by John Wagner and Alan Grant that was published in several of the White Dwarf journals. A named GW designer, on record, nearly 4 decades later, naming the creators and the publication vehicle. That confirmation taking that long to surface is itself part of the story. By 1986, Malal had made it into the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay Core book as a renegade chaos god. Spring 1987 brought White Dwarf miniature sets for Jake and Hellwood, the Chaos Brothers who served as Caleb Dark's primary adversaries across the strip. That same year, the Chaos Marauders card game included a card called Claws of Malal, representing a Beastmen warband. 5 documented appearances in official GW material across 3 years, plus whatever additional issues the comic ran in, described by Priestley only as several of the White Dwarf journals. Models were planned. Concept art existed. Realm of Chaos. The foundational documentation of the entire Chaos pantheon was in development, and Malal was being positioned inside it. The commercial trajectory was clear. A 4th chapter of the quest of Caleb Dark was being prepared to complete the story. That 4th chapter was never published. Caleb Dark himself is described in community sources as a grim and gloomy anti-hero chaos champion, and that framing is worth sitting with for a moment. Every chaos god in the setting produces a recognizable champion archetype. Khorne's champions are berserker warriors, men so given to bloodshed that they've become its instrument. Slaanesh's are seductive and corrupted, Aesthetes who've chased sensation into the abyss. Nurgles are plague spreaders who've accepted their own dissolution with terrible peace. Tzeentches are scheming sorcerers who've traded sanity for knowledge they couldn't survive knowing. Caleb Dark's archetype is a chaos warrior hunting other chaos warriors. He fought at the Siege of Prague. He confronted followers of Khorne. He opposed the Skaven. His mandate wasn't to destroy humanity or spread corruption or deepen the influence of the ruinous powers in the world. It was to attack other chaos forces from within on behalf of a god who existed specifically to destroy them. That is a structurally different role than any other champion in the setting. Caleb Dark's victories made the world more stable, not less. Killing a Khorne warband doesn't serve Chaos's goals, it undermines them. Malal's domain is documented in the Warhammer Fantasy fandom wiki, drawing on original publication text, as the embodiment of Chaos's indiscriminate tendency towards destruction, anarchy, and infighting, even among its own individual divine agents. A god specifically oriented against every other divine agent of chaos, including, at the logical extreme, himself. The four mainstream chaos gods recruit through corruption. Khorne collects worshippers from soldiers and warriors who've been in enough combat that bloodlust becomes its own compulsion, who've crossed the threshold from fighting to survive into fighting because it's the only thing that makes them feel real. Nurgle collects from plague survivors whose gratitude at still breathing curdles slowly into devotion toward the force that spared them. Slaanesh collects from artists, hedonists, and aesthetes who chased sensation past every reasonable limit and found something waiting on the other side. Tzeentch collects from scholars, politicians, anyone who wanted more knowledge or more power than was safe to want, whose ambition opened a door they couldn't close from the inside. None of these require a moment of genuine decision. You don't enlist for chaos, you drift. The corruption is incremental. The threshold isn't clearly marked until you've already crossed it, and by the time you understand what's happening, it has already happened. That's the functional horror of the setting's four primary gods. They're patient. They're gradual. The slide into their service looks, from the inside, like ordinary human failing until it's too late. Malal required intention. To serve the god of opposing chaos, you had to consciously choose to oppose chaos. No drift, no gradual slide pulling you in without your awareness. Malal's only recruits were people who looked at the ruinous powers, understood what they were, decided they needed to be fought, and then discovered that the only available divine support for that mission was itself a chaos god. The theological knot is genuinely elegant, an anti-chaos god that is still chaos, accessible only to people clear-eyed enough about chaos to actively resist it. The one recruit profile in the chaos pantheon that requires the worshipper to be awake. And then the paradox sharpens. Malal's power came from chaos. His function was to destroy chaos. If his champions succeeded, if they actually pursued the mission to its conclusion and dismantled the other chaos gods, Malal would have nothing left to feed on. His victory and his dissolution are the same event. A chaos god designed to win himself out of existence. Every battle his champions won brought him incrementally closer to the moment that ends him. This is either a fatal flaw in the concept, or it's the concept. A self-consuming force isn't incoherent in mythological terms. It's a specific sacred function. Something that prevents the dominant force from completing itself, not by being stronger, but by being inside it and eroding it continuously, with no option for total victory that doesn't also mean total self-destruction. Whether Wagner and Grant thought through the full theological implications, or whether it emerged from following the logic of a comic strip about a grim chaos warrior fighting other chaos warriors in 1985 White Dwarf pages, that answer departed with the unpublished fourth chapter. The concept's sophistication is either deliberate design or what happens when an interesting premise is followed honestly wherever it leads. Both of those are good outcomes for a mythology. By 1987, GW considered it commercially viable enough to build a model range around. The in-universe documentation of chaos theology that survived the erasure sits primarily in the Liber Chaotica, published as a complete volume on July 5, 2005, by Richard Williams and Marijan von Stauffer, 416 pages. Structured as a 5-volume, in-universe academic text written by a man named Richter Kless, described by the Warhammer Fantasy fandom wiki as a former priest of Sigmar who was later deemed insane. The cult of Sigmar had tasked him with studying the nature of the ruinous powers. He studied them comprehensively enough that the study consumed him. What remains is the document. Richter Kless as a narrator is a deliberate epistemological problem. A respected scholar and theologian, described as capable enough that the cult of Sigmar trusted him to document their greatest existential threat, produced a 5-volume comprehensive study of chaos while being corrupted by the subject of his research. How much of the Liber Chaotica is accurate theology, and how much is the corruption expressing itself through the language of scholarship? The text presents itself as authoritative. The author's biography is the warning label attached to the cover. Khorne, Slaanesh, Tzeentch, Nurgle, all documented, all analyzed through Kless's scholar-turned-madman lens. 5 volumes, 416 pages. The god of chaos opposing chaos is absent from all of it. The comment engagement pattern on Liber Chaotica references in the source analytics, 13 replies, 0 likes, says something precise about what this audience does with primary source material. They don't passively consume it, they argue about it. 0 likes means nobody agreed with anyone. 13 replies means everyone had something to say. The implication of Kless's unreliable narrator status generates active argument rather than passive reception. The question of which parts of his scholarship are accurate and which are the poison working through him is genuinely unresolvable from inside the text, and this audience knows it. The argument that Malal's absence from the Liber Chaotica generates is quieter. It's not in the text, it's in the shape of the text. A 5-volume comprehensive study of chaos that doesn't include the chaos god of opposing chaos tells you something, not about the setting's theology, but about when the book was assembled and what was legally available to put in it. Richter Kless gave his sanity to documenting the ruinous powers completely. His document has a god-shaped hole in it because the name that would have filled it was legally unavailable in 2005. John Wagner is primarily known as the co-creator of Judge Dredd. He has been working at 2000 AD since 1977. Alan Grant was his writing partner through much of that run. The two collaborated extensively throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, building careers in a freelance ecosystem that was, at the time, still actively working out a question the British comics industry hadn't settled. Who owns the creative output of a freelance writer commissioned by a publishing company? This wasn't a minor ambiguity in 1985. 2000 AD's own history has documented episodes of creator rights disputes. The American comics industry was going through a related convulsion in the same period, which eventually produced the Image Comics breakaway in 1992, a direct consequence of major publisher creators deciding that work-for-hire terms were unacceptable for characters that had generated significant commercial value. The British scene was operating in the same unresolved territory, a few years behind the most public confrontations, but with the same underlying tension between publishers who assumed commissioned work was theirs and creators who had started asking why. When Games Workshop commissioned The Quest of Caleb Dark for White Dwarf in 1985, the contract between GW and Wagner and Grant apparently didn't specify clearly who owned the characters created through the work. Per community-documented accounts drawing on interview fragments, both parties had a credible claim. GW presumably treated the arrangement as standard work for hire. Company pays for content, company owns content. Wagner and Grant, coming from a 2000 AD background where the creator rights question was actively contested, appear to have understood the arrangement differently, or understood it the same way, until the commercial implications became visible enough to change the calculation. The trigger was the model line. By 1987, Games Workshop was preparing Realm of Chaos, the definitive documentation of the Chaos Pantheon, and developing concept art for a physical miniature range built around Malal's characters. Models meant a product line. A product line meant sustained commercial revenue from these characters, projected forward indefinitely, without any mechanism to compensate the people who created them. Wagner and Grant reportedly copyrighted the original characters from the Quest of Caleb Dark before GW could complete the commercialization. GW was, according to community-documented accounts, blindsided by the claim. An agreement wasn't reached. GW reportedly declined to pay what sources describe as a relatively modest licensing fee. The choice they made, stopping use of the character rather than contesting the ownership or negotiating a licensing relationship, appears to have been a straightforward commercial calculation. Malal wasn't worth the ongoing legal exposure or the contractual relationship. Simpler to remove and move on. Where the evidentiary record is genuinely thin, no court documents surface in the available materials. No official GW statement acknowledges the dispute. No direct public statement from Wagner or Grant specifically about Malal has been found. Rick Priestley's 2024 interview confirms the creation attribution. Wagner and Grant, Caleb Dark comic strip, White Dwarf, not the legal sequence. What exists is a coherent, internally consistent account built from circumstantial evidence that fits every documented data point. The fourth chapter never published. The model line never produced. The Realm of Chaos books appearing in 1988 without Malal, and the documented internal GW behavior in the years that followed. That internal behavior is the most concrete part of the record. Ken Rolston had already drafted a Malal cult into Something Rotten in Kislev, a module for the Enemy Within WFRP campaign. That cult was subsequently replaced with two freshly invented minor chaos entities, Zuvasin the Undoer and Nekoho the Doubter. Someone inside GW reviewed the in-progress manuscript and made the substitution. That's an editorial correction driven by something other than narrative preference. You don't replace a drafted character with two newly invented ones because you liked the original less. Graham Davis, working on the WFRP DEI section at approximately the same time, reportedly wasn't told that Malal was off-limits before publication. The 1986 WFRP core book contains Malal because the internal communications about the removal hadn't reached every in-progress project. That's what a legal patch applied under reactive pressure looks like on the inside. Not a clean, coordinated sweep, but a spreading awareness that gradually reached each writer and editor who had the name in a working document, leaving behind a trail of partially completed workarounds at different stages of the publication pipeline. William King wrote a story called The Laughter of the Dark Gods for the 1989 GW Books anthology, Ignorant Armies. Per documented community accounts, the story was directly relevant to Malal, relevant enough in concept and territory that it clearly engaged with the same mythology, but couldn't use the character or name. A GW writer, producing GW fiction in a GW anthology, working around a hole in his own company's mythology because the name was legally unavailable. He wrote the story anyway, around the gap, because the gap had a shape, and the shape was worth writing about. That isn't the behavior of a company that made a creative decision. That is the behavior of a company that had a legal patch applied to it and was managing the consequences through ongoing creative workarounds, writer by writer, project by project, across multiple years. 14 years of official silence. Then, in 2002, in the second Chaos Space Marines Codex of 3rd edition Warhammer 40,000, a warband appeared that had no business existing if Malal was really gone. Their name is the Sons of Malice. Their patron entity carries the titles the Lost, the Renegade God, the Pariah, the Hierarch of Anarchy, and terror. Lexicanum describes him as an outcast chaos god, representing anarchy incarnate. The 40K fandom wiki classifies him as a minor chaos god. His warband is documented as enemies of the Imperium of Man and the other forces of chaos alike, who raided and slaughtered other chaos warbands within the Eye of Terror. The entity's name in all 40,000 appearances is Malice, not Malal. Sons of Malice also appear in the Codex Eye of Terror, a 3rd edition supplement whose PDF is publicly archived. They're listed in the Traitor Warband table alongside Wordbearers, World Eaters, and Thousand Sons, the setting's most established chaos factions, the chapters that anchor entire army ranges, the names every 40,000 player knows by reflex. Sons of Malice are in that table as a coordinate entry, not hidden in an appendix or tucked into a footnote, treated structurally as equivalent to factions that have been central to 40,000 since its earliest editions. White Dwarf issue 303, published in approximately 2005, expanded on the Sons of Malice with additional material. The entity Malice was reportedly referenced as recently as a short book called The Labyrinth, believed to be from around 2016. After that, silence again. No new material, no dedicated codex expansion, no army range built around the most philosophically distinctive faction in the Eye of Terror, a chaos warband whose entire purpose is fighting other chaos warbands, whose patrons' titles include the Renegade God, and whose existence implies a structural principle in the setting that the 4 primary chaos gods can't account for. Games Workshop has never officially acknowledged the connection between Malice and Malal. The 40,000 fandom wiki states the position plainly. Malice is canon, though only by the barest of margins. Malal no longer is. 13 years separated the original removal in 1988 from the first 40,000 appearance in 2002. Enough temporal distance that the renamed entity arrived without the context of an obvious workaround, even though the architecture underneath it's obviously that. What GW preserved in the Sons of Malice Codex entry is the functional identity of the original concept, a renegade god whose champions attack other chaos forces as their primary mission, simultaneously an enemy of the Imperium and an enemy of the other chaos factions, existing in principled opposition to the power structures that define the setting. One letter changed on the name, the concept stayed. The theology inside the concept, the specific way Malal's domain created a structural role in the great game that nothing else fills, that question was left open, present only as shadow, in a codex entry that carefully never mentions what it grew from. Malice is described in official material as weaker than the 4 primary chaos gods, appearing only weakly materialized without a proper host over millennia. That power differential is consistent with the original concept in a way that's either deliberate design continuity or accidentally accurate. A god whose power derives from chaos, directed against chaos, would be limited by the scale of available opposition and the size of his worshipper base. 4 primary gods have billions of followers generating warp energy continuously across a galaxy. Malice has a renegade space marine chapter operating in the Eye of Terror. The power gap maps directly to the asymmetry in support. All 4 mainstream chaos gods represent conditions you can slip into without making a conscious choice. Rage accumulates. Decay spreads. Lust consumes incrementally from the inside. Paranoia feeds on information until it becomes the lens through which everything is processed. None of these require a moment of genuine decision. The corruption does the work, and the worshipper participates without realizing they've chosen. Malice is the one whose service requires intention. You can't accidentally become a champion of the god who opposes chaos. You have to know what you're opposing. You have to decide to oppose it. And you have to accept that the divine support available for that opposition is itself part of the thing you're opposing. That's either a profound design or a deeply inconvenient one for a game company that needs clean faction identity and purchasable miniature ranges. The Sons of Malice sit in the Codex without an army box. The most philosophically interesting thing in the Eye of Terror doesn't move product because you can't build a brand around a god whose nature resists completion. The Great Game, the eternal conflict between the four chaos gods, is one of Warhammer's most elegant structural elements and one of its most operationally convenient narrative ones. Four gods of near infinite power in perpetual war, none capable of destroying the others, their mutual antagonism maintaining a balance that prevents any single power from consolidating enough force to end everything. Khorne and Slaanesh are natural antagonists. Tzeentch and Nurgle occupy opposite ends of the change versus stasis axis. All four compete for souls, for territory, for the warp energy generated by mortal suffering. The Great Game is, in a meaningful structural sense, why the setting's universe survives. The Chaos Gods are probably, collectively, more powerful than any other faction. If they coordinated, they'd have won. They don't coordinate because their fundamental natures make cooperation against their own individual interests. Cooperation requires accepting a smaller share of the total gain, and none of the four are built for delayed gratification. So they keep fighting each other, the universe keeps surviving, and every other faction exists in the gap that mutual antagonism maintains. Malal, as originally designed, would have introduced a fifth structural principle to that dynamic. Not a fifth god competing for the same resources, but a force whose function was to consume the other god's power from within. His champions didn't raid human settlements or spread plague or deepen the ruinous power's hold on the mortal world. They attacked chaos forces. Power derived from the warp turned back against the warp. The structural role this creates isn't equivalent to adding a fifth player to the Great Game. It's closer to adding a regulator, something that specifically targets whichever chaos force accumulates enough momentum to threaten the balance and erodes it from the inside. Without that principle, the Great Game runs as a four-way deadlock maintained purely by mutual opposition. With Malal, the balance has a corrective mechanism built into it. Chaos is contained not just because the gods fight each other, but because something within chaos is specifically designed to prevent any of them from winning decisively enough to exit the stalemate. The paradox at the center of this gives the concept genuine mythological depth. A chaos god whose victory destroys his own power source. Self-consuming forces appear in most serious mythological traditions because they serve a function nothing else fills. They prevent completion, prevent any dominant principle from finalizing itself. Malal, as a structural element in the Great Game, would mean that the game itself has an internal corrective mechanism, not externally imposed by protagonists or by the specific operational competence of non-chaos factions, but emerging from chaos's own internal logic. Without him, the narrative compensates through external pressure, the Emperor's will, the resilience of the Astartes, the specific capabilities of every faction that isn't chaos. Chaos keeps failing to win because protagonists keep stopping it, not because anything in the nature of chaos prevents it from completing itself. The structural whole is covered over with plot. The mythological architecture where the setting would have been self-regulating, where chaos carried within it the force that stopped chaos from finishing, is absent. Sons of Malice raid other chaos warbands in the Eye of Terror. Malice holds the title, the Renegade God, in official canon. The concept of an anti-chaos principle exists as a character note in a codex entry. The structural function that character note points toward isn't integrated into how the Great Game actually works in the current setting. 4 independent commenters raise the same issue separately. No coordination, none building on what another had said, about a related fracture in the setting's origin mythology. One of them put the problem directly. That's centering the setting on humanity to a comically stupid degree. Their objection? Slaanesh's documented origin requires the fall of a galaxy-spanning civilization, while the most common community reading of Khorne's origin places his emergence in medieval human warfare. Slaanesh's birth is written in detail in official canon. The fall of the Eldar, the collapse of a star-spanning civilization across thousands of years of escalating hedonism and excess, culminates in a psychic detonation. That explosion tears a hole in the fabric of reality. The wound is the Eye of Terror. The spiritual energy released by the collective death of an entire species, their souls consumed in the moment of detonation, generates enough warp energy to birth a new chaos god. That is the documented threshold for Slaanesh's emergence, a galactic civilization's annihilation. The most widely cited community reading of Khorne's emergence places it in medieval human violence. One planet, one species in its pre-gunpowder phase, feudal-scale warfare. Against the death of a star-spanning empire. Not the same order of magnitude. The comically stupid degree comment isn't just snark. It's a real structural complaint. If Slaanesh requires galactic-scale psychic trauma, the mechanism that produces chaos gods appears incompatible with a single planet's worth of medieval bloodshed. What the available record doesn't provide is specific official GW text establishing Khorne's origin as medieval humanity rather than something older. GW hasn't published a canonical origin timeline specifying exactly when each chaos god coalesced and what threshold of warp energy triggered them. The medieval human reading of Khorne's origin is widespread in community interpretation, but isn't anchored to specific canonical text the way Slaanesh's Eldar Fall origin is. It's reportedly drawn from early Warhammer source material that described Khorne as fed by human battlefield violence, interpreted by the community as an origin claim rather than a description of ongoing sustenance. An alternative reading exists in the War in Heaven lore. Under this interpretation, Khorne doesn't emerge from feudal Europe at all. He emerges from the most violent conflict in galactic history, the war between the Necrons and the Old Ones that predates humanity entirely, a conflict credited with wounding the warp itself and beginning the long corruption of reality. That scale asymmetry between Slaanesh and Khorne collapses if Khorne's origins are in a war that makes the fall of the Eldar look limited by comparison. GW has allowed both readings to coexist without resolving the tension between them. 4 commenters noticed the apparent inconsistency, and none of them offered a defense of the official framing, because the official framing hasn't been clearly stated in terms that would settle the question. The reason this connects to the Malal thesis is the pattern it reveals. Both the Khorne origin ambiguity and the Slaanesh origin specificity were produced by different writers in different decades, building on top of a mythology that started with quasi-medieval humans in a single-continent fantasy setting and had to retroactively scale up to accommodate a 40,000-year future galaxy-spanning universe. The seams are visible wherever you push on the structure. In Khorne's unresolved timeline, in the apparent scale asymmetry of the chaos god origin thresholds, in the question of whether these gods are prehistoric forces or products of a specific historical catastrophe. Malal's origin mythology was never written. The copyright dispute arrived exactly when GW was building the foundational canon for the Chaos Pantheon, the realm of chaos books that were supposed to establish how the gods worked, where they came from, how they related to each other and to the mortal world. Whatever the intended answer was to the question of what scale of event produces a god of anti-chaos, what kind of war, what kind of loss, what kind of self-directed destruction, that answer left with the character in 1988 and was never recovered. 3 fracture points in the same mythology running parallel. Khorne's origin, contested between incompatible readings the setting hasn't resolved. Slaanesh's origin, cosmically documented in a way that creates apparent inconsistency with the more common Khorne reading. Malal's origin, absent entirely, the question permanently open. These aren't 3 separate continuity failures. They're the same failure, produced by the same force. A mythology built in layers, by different writers, across different eras, without a unified document constraining them, and visible at the joints to anyone who pushes on the structure with any sustained pressure. There's a version of this story where Games Workshop is the corporate villain. A company that absorbed a freelancer's creation, panicked when the creators asserted their rights, chose deletion over a modest licensing fee, then patched the hole with a renamed workaround 13 years later. That version contains real elements. The internal evidence is genuine. The fourth chapter never published. The model line never made. William King writing around the gap in his own company's fiction. Ken Ralston's Malal cult quietly replaced with two entities nobody ever quotes. The mythology fracture is the more durable story. Malal was the one chaos god whose existence posed a question the setting hasn't answered in his absence. What, within chaos itself, functions as a limit on chaos? The Great Game provides mutual opposition between the four primary gods, a balance mechanism, not a corrective one. It prevents any single god from winning, but it doesn't prevent chaos from expanding, corrupting, and consuming. Malal's structural function was different, a force specifically designed to eat the expansion itself, to turn the energy of chaos back inward, with no possibility of victory that didn't also mean dissolution. Built-in self-regulation, generated from within the mythology rather than imposed on it from outside. Without him, the question remains open. The narrative patches the gap with external resistance, human will, the Emperor's presence, the operational capacity of the Astartes, the competencies of every non-chaos faction. Chaos keeps failing to complete itself because protagonists keep stopping it. The mythological mechanism that would have built the failure of chaos into the structure of chaos itself left with the copyright in 1988 and was never fully replaced. Richter Kless documented Khorne, Slaanesh, Tzeentch, and Nurgle across 5 volumes and 416 pages until the study destroyed him. He gave his sanity to produce the most comprehensive account of the ruinous powers that exists inside the setting. His scholarship doesn't mention Malal. A man who sacrificed his mind to document chaos completely produced a document with a god-shaped hole in it, because the name he would have needed to fill the hole was legally unavailable when the text was assembled. The absence is both a copyright consequence and, accidentally, a theological one. The scholar who dedicated everything to understanding chaos didn't know the god who opposed it existed. Ken Ralston's replacement deities, Zuvasan the Undoer and Nekaho the Doubter, served their narrative function and fulfilled their legal purpose. Neither of them has generated, across any comment section in the observable record, the gravitational pull that Malal produces from outside the official canon. 3 unprompted mentions in a video that wasn't specifically about him. 0 people have written, "Pour one out for Zuvasan." The substitution worked legally. It didn't work mythologically. The community senses the shape of the gap that was left, without always being able to articulate exactly why that particular gap has weight. The 4th chapter of The Quest of Caleb Dark was never published. A story that started in White Dwarf issue 83 in 1985 ran for 3 years through combat at Prague and confrontations with Khorne's followers and opposition to the Skaven, ended without its ending because the contract beneath the creative work was ambiguous enough that it couldn't survive commercialization. A chaos warrior hunting other chaos warriors on behalf of a chaos god who opposed chaos never got his conclusion. Not because anyone decided the story was finished, because intellectual property law is, in its way, a kind of chaos, and GW's chosen resolution was to stop using the name. The entity survives. Malice holds the title the Renegade God in 40,000 official canon. Sons of Malice still raid other chaos warbands in the Eye of Terror. The concept lives under a different label, at the barest margin of official acknowledgement, in a codex entry that carefully never mentions what it grew from. 13 years passed between the removal and the reappearance. A renamed god arrived without context, carrying the same structural function, under enough temporal distance that drawing the line back required the community, rather than the publisher, to make the connection visible. 3 commenters in a single video's comment section noticed the same absence without knowing each other had noticed it. One wrote a eulogy, one wrote a shout, one wrote a wish that the workaround had been developed into something real. None of them were wrong. All of them were feeling the shape of the same gap, the place in the theology where a god who opposed chaos used to stand, before a contract dispute made his name legally unavailable and his concept was filed away under a different word. Chaos kept winning. The god who was supposed to fight it from the inside is gone from the fantasy canon, surviving in 40K under a different name at the margin of acknowledgement. Kept alive primarily by the people who notice the gap and keep marking it without being prompted. Pour one out for Malal. He turned his heart against the other chaos gods, and the other chaos gods apparently had better contracts. If the seams in mythologies interest you as much as the mythologies themselves, subscribe.